Good evening, friends. Welcome back to Science Distilled Virtual Edition. We are so glad you are here with us. We are so glad you are hopefully safe and healthy. And we are very excited to bring you a special event on wildfire smoke and the tools that are really driving the science towards solutions. This evening, we are welcoming two pioneering scientists to share their work on some of the biggest challenges that the Western US faces today, wildfire and smoke. They will not only help us understand what it means that fires are at an increasing intensity and scale, but they will also share with us breakthrough research that will help us ultimately coexist with fire. Before we go any further, we at DRI and the Discovery want to acknowledge the original and continued sovereignty of Native nations in our region and everywhere. We acknowledge that the places where we conduct science have deep ancestral ties to Indigenous peoples, and we celebrate that these communities continue to thrive today. If you are here on Zoom, we welcome you to type your questions in the chat at any time. When it is time for the Q&A at the very end, we will call on audience members to unmute and ask the questions that they submitted through the chat. So remember what you asked. Otherwise, keep yourself on mute. You are welcome to turn on your video. We love to see your smiling faces in this cool virtual space. So Science Distilled is co-hosted by the Terry Lee Wells Discovery Museum and the Desert Research Institute. DRI is the environmental research arm of the Nevada System of Higher Education. And I'd now like to introduce Patrick Turner to tell us a little bit about the Discovery.
Thanks, Megan. I appreciate that. It's great to see so many people join us tonight. And we really wish we could be in person. We were so close, but obviously the time is just not quite right. So thank goodness we can pivot to Zoom fairly easily. For those of you who know about the Discovery, thanks for joining us. If you're not familiar, we're a hands-on science center located in downtown Reno. We welcome learners of all ages. So regardless of your age or your interests, we hope that you'll come visit us downtown at 490 South Center Street in downtown Reno. And now, one of the sponsors of the Science Distilled series and where we normally host the event is the Patagonia outlet. And Kelly, why don't you tell us what's going on at Patagonia these days?
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, we're really sorry we can't be in person. We've been a longtime partner of Science Distilled, and we really hope to see everyone in person soon, but we're really excited you're here to join us. For those of you not familiar with the Patagonia outlet in Reno, we're an outdoor retailer. We're just down the street from the Discovery at 130 South Center. And in addition to clothing, we're an activist company. So we really seek to get visibility to the work that's done in our community, not only from environmental activism, also social justice work, and also to support the science that's going on. So we're just a longtime supporter of the Science Distilled program and excited to be here tonight.
Thank you so much, Kelly. We can't express how appreciative you've been all these years and through the pandemic and all the work that you've done to support community events just like this. So thank you so much. We like to jump right into the reason we're here, which is to hear about great science. And so with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Tim Brown. He's a scientist at the Desert Research Institute, and he focuses on wildland fire climate and fire weather connections. And he also works very closely at the interface between science and decision making. Dr. Brown is the director of the Western Regional Climate Center, and we're very, very fortunate that he's with us tonight. So with that, Tim, I will pass it off to you.
Thank you very much, Megan. Let me get my screen shared here properly. All right, I think we're good to go. So welcome everyone to the 420 millionth 2021 year of biomass burning on Earth. Well, this may not be a precise number, but we can safely say that fire has been around for a long time. More recently, on October 8th, 1542, Juan Cabrillo, the first European to explore California, sighted smoke around San Pedro Bay. And we've been citing smoke in California and elsewhere and commenting on it ever since. But the fire environment has changed a lot since Cabrillo's first smoke sighting. These days, fire starts with a single spark and can grow to nearly 1 million acres inside its perimeter. We've had a couple of these now in recent times in California. Now, unfortunately, we see stories like this which go off in the news.
Unaware of which way the fire is going. They have so many fires, they can't really keep track at this point, and they also cannot get through the fire. So I don't know.
So with the confluence of a warming and drying climate, more fuels to burn, and people living in naturally fire-prone areas, there are not necessarily more fires, but there are more large and destructive fires. But there's another side to fire, and that is the research to understand how fire works and what is its impacts, both positive and negative. The U.S. Forest Service has evolved considerably since the early 1900s when it was formed. And if we look at this table here for a moment, we can think about that the 1910s and 20s were fires forestry, 50s and 60s fires physics, the 70s and 80s fires biology. All of these are still active areas today, but especially from the 2000s to present, fire is interdisciplinary. There's the physical science aspects of fire and the social science aspects of fire. And more, and I'm very happy to see this, that these two are also being integrated so that fire is starting to be thought about as more of a holistic phenomenon. Because of the potential firefighter safety and overall societal and environmental impacts, there is a strong desire to better understand just how fire interacts with its environment. So here's what I want to do. I want you to join me in becoming a fire scientist. So place yourself in that position while you're sitting there on your couch. And now from a science perspective, the question for you is, what all was happening this July 19th day? Trying to get the screen to advance. It's not. There we go. What all was happening on this July 19th day on the Dixie Fire? I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about it.
There's 68 people.
Okay, so that was 3 hours of the fire compressed down. Did you enjoy the show? I mean, this is reality theater. All right. The fire, Dixie Fire, began on July 13th, and it's still ongoing today. And it's one of those that's very close to being one of those million-acre fires. This summer's Washoe Valley air quality was the worst based on modern reports. You likely noticed this. 2019 is the blue line here. 2020 was last year, and we thought last year was bad. And this year in red, 2021, at least based on this graph, is going off the chart. So it was definitely a year of very poor air quality here in the Washoe Valley. And it turns out that smoke modeling is hard. You have to have a lot of physics and chemistry data and the right mathematical models to make predictions. So remember, now you're a scientist with me. So your next task is to predict the concentration of smoke particulates and where this smoke is going to be in the next 3, 6, and 24 hours from now from the Caldor fire. This was on August 30th. And by the way, we threw in the Dixie Fire up on top there, just for fun as well. So once you got Caldor smoke modeled, then also include Dixie Fire. And by the way, any other smoke that's around, you need to include that as well. Okay, so you got this? We good to go? So there are a number of research questions before us, obviously about fire, but by golly, we do have a design scientific experiment for you. And that's what I want to talk about now. It's called the Fire and Smoke Model Evaluation Experiment, FASME for short. It's a large integrated multi-agency fire study. And on the left here are the project leads, of which I am one. And over here on the right are the science leads representing federal agencies as well as academic entities. And to prove all this is real, we got a number of very colorful logos down at the bottom, representing all of the partnerships involved in this endeavor. So FASME was conceived a number of years ago. I don't actually remember the first year when it probably started to appear, but it has evolved over time. And I will say that what you're going to see here is not the full FASME experiment. We're still trying to get that together. And by getting together, I mean seeking the funding that's needed to support the project. But we have done enough, and we know enough how to do this. And so I will walk you through some of the initial experiments and that have been undertaken and what those might look like. So the overall FASME goal, kind of a mouthful here, to use innovative and efficient measurement techniques to collect critical observational data that are necessary to evaluate and advance operationally used fire and smoke modeling systems. But let's put this another way in terms of, well, what are the FASME outcomes and community impacts? What do we really want to get out of this that's going to matter to everyone? So the first is expand scientific knowledge of the complex fuels, fire, and smoke chemistry system. And it's really a physics and chemistry system, but there is a lot of emphasis on atmospheric chemistry and smoke chemistry in this effort. Next is develop new, more advanced fire and smoke operational models based on the collection of an unprecedented data set. When FASME happens, an experiment like this has never happened before anywhere. And so it's very exciting to think about that we could bring all of these teams together and collect such a data set that we can actually advance existing models and create new ones that are going to improve the predictions. And some of these models and predictions are going to impact you because they will lead to better smoke forecasts, better fire forecasts. It's not all about us, it's also about the ecosystems. And so we can improve the ecological outcomes of planned burns, those prescribed fires that you hear about, successful revegetation, and improve control efforts following destructive fires. And we can provide new information for addressing the health and safety of wildland firefighters, those folks that are right there next to that smoke and those flames all day long, who are exposed to potentially hazardous levels of concentrated toxins in smoke. And these are for extended periods, and also for smoke transport of infectious microbes. And this is going to be a topic that David's going to discuss shortly coming up. A lot of logistics involved in an experiment like this. But the data collection alone, we identified 6 science disciplines. These include fuels, the fire behavior energy, the plume meteorology, the smoke, the modeling, and the fire effects. And here on the right, I have a colorful schematic to prove that that's correct. That is the right answer. Because what this highlights is we've got instrumentation on the ground, through the atmosphere, and even into space, because there's opportunities to utilize fixed geostationary satellite data as well as orbiting satellite data. So the idea is when we have the grand experiment, all this gets coordinated from the ground on up to the satellites. And we all piece that together, and when we're done, we'll have a much better understanding of how wildfire works. So when the project was conceived, we knew that we wanted to do something in the Southwest, and we knew that we wanted to do something in the Southeast. So by the time we were ready to start some initial experiments, the federal agencies, NOAA, NASA, and the National Science Foundation had allocated several aircraft to fly around this circle in the West during the 2018 wildfire season and collect air samples from smoke and collect air samples from the chemistry. So those data are being analyzed now. FASME played a role in this by we were able to tell them for some of the cases, we didn't do it for all of them, but for some of the cases, we could tell them about the fuels on the ground. So they would have a better understanding of, well, they're seeing this smoke or this chemistry, where exactly is that coming from? In 2019 and 2020, the Fish Lake National Forest management team wanted to do a pretty significant prescribed burning effort, and this is what I'm going to describe in some detail next, in Fish Lake National Forest in western Utah. Next year, there's some plans to do some prescribed burning at Fort Stewart down in Georgia, and so there'll be some FASME involvement in that experiment as well. But what I'm now going to start to show you are some things about the Fish Lake burn in 2019. And hopefully this will give you an idea of the different aspects of what took place. But also remember, you're a scientist with us tonight, so be thinking about your questions and how you would want to answer these with the data that we're collecting. So the primary experiment here I'm going to show you is a place called Manning Creek. again in Fish Lake National Forest. The purpose of this burn is aspen restoration project. Here in this photo, you see a little bit of aspen in the fall on both sides, but this it was supposed to be a much bigger area of aspen, not taken over by the forest that's here now. And so in order to do that, this whole thing needs to be burned out. Now, the question is, do you believe me? If we light a high intensity fire in here, will the forest come back the way that we want it? If you walk into that forest, this is what it looks like. Do you think that's a healthy looking forest? It's a mixed conifer, a lot of disease in it, a lot of dead and down material. It's 50 to 70 tons per acre of material. I don't know what you want to equate that to, but I guess think about railroad cars or semi trucks loaded with electronic goods or metal or something. It's, you know, all stacked up to give you 50 to 70 tons per acre. That's what we're talking about. So it's probably easy for you to imagine that, say, this dead material here got struck by lightning, how easily it would be for this to really take off and burn. So let's describe now what it is we're actually going to do. This red outline indicates the area of interest. This red area up here is an area that was burned in the spring of 2019. Successfully burned, and we call that a black line for the burn that we want to conduct, which is going to be in this area. And the reason for that is we want to be able to control this fire. It's going to be big, it's going to be hot, and there's no interest from anyone having this thing escape and be a problem. So when this fire burns up against this line, it's going to stop. There was another black line put over here in the fall of 2017. So here's the plan. We're going to take people on the ground and light fires down here, and we're going to have helicopters flying overhead, putting in fire lines, putting in ignition patterns. And that's a science in itself, how you do these ignition patterns, because given the landscape and topography, that's going to dictate in large part what can happen with that fire, how it can burn. The idea is if we light fires down here in this valley depressed area, it's going to run uphill. And it's depicted by these arrows. So how are we going to measure this? Well, we put the plume and meteorology team on this hill over here. We put the smoke team over here. We put the fuels teams are here. This is where their primary measurements came from. And we put the fire behavior instrumentation here. There won't be people in this burn area, right? But they will be on the edges. And there are a lot of safety protocols to make sure that everyone's accounted for. So now that we know what's going to happen, let's take a look at what did happen. How do you do these ignitions? Well, you can drive a little cart along the ground and use your flamethrower and light a line. Or you can put ping pong balls full of combustible material in the bottom of a helicopter and drop those along a line, particularly in rough terrain that you can't drive in. Notice there's snow on the ground here. This is not the same ignition group that was used for the fire that we're focused on. But it does demonstrate, it shows you how they're done, but also that you can conduct very successful prescribed fires even when there's snow on the ground. And in fact, a lot of the times this is what you want because this is going to help be a controlling factor. And so given these kinds of ignitions, this is the kind of fire you can get even when there's snow on the ground. So from the fire that we're talking about, this is what it looked like at one point in the fire. Does that look like a pretty bad fire to you? Does that look like a wildfire? Well, it does look like a wildfire, but it's a prescribed fire. It is being controlled. But that's what we needed to happen. We wanted a prescribed fire that was very close to a wildfire, as close as we could get without doing any damage. Because again, we're measuring all these different disciplines that we've talked about, in this fire, in this area. Just another picture of the flames coming out of the forest and closer to a meadow area. We had cameras placed in the forest. I'm going to let you take a minute here and watch the fire front come through. And this is what it looked like afterwards. Everybody's fine. Even the cameras are fine. These are the cameras. One of these is where that video came from. They're specially designed to be experimental cameras and put in conditions like that and the film extracted. But obviously that's also a good depiction. Not only can the fire behavior and energy researchers study details in that flame, but that's also highlights the dangers that firefighters face when they're out on the front lines. Then we had good plumes for smoke. We got what we wanted for that. Here's the radar, the meteorology group on the ground pointing their radar toward these plumes. And we can get some very neat data out of these. Here's something called reflectivity. Here's the base of the fire. Here's the smoke going up in the air and dispersing. Here's a different measurement of it. Here are a couple of related statistical measures. And a very cool thing is if you take similar instruments called LiDARs and triangulate them around that plume, you'll get a full 3D view of what that plume looks like. And so that'll be part of the full PHASMI experiment when that happens. The idea then is to take all those data, put it into computer models so that we can study and analyze the results and ultimately make predictions. Here's a weather model that includes a fire part and includes a smoke part. And unmanned aerial systems are very beneficial for these kinds of experiments. And so here's a unit that was launched, and here's a couple of night views of the fire. So the fire took place in the afternoon, but it was allowed to burn into the night. David, in the next presentation here very shortly, is going to show you an example about using UAS. So we talked about our disciplines: fuels, plume, meteorology, modeling, fire behavior, and smoke. The last one is fire effects. So you saw the fire, you saw what happened. Do you think everything turned out all right? Well, just a few months later, the fire effects folks went back in and saw the first of the aspen sprouting, and then more aspen sprouting. And by fall, There was enough aspen starting to regenerate the forest. We even had autumn colors. So yes, this was a very successful burn and a very successful experiment. So to conclude, this is an experiment like this is hugely a shared stewardship. Not only is it a large number of people on research teams, but you also have the fire management teams. This particular picture is from a Signal Peak prescribed burn in November of 2020, but it's to give you the idea that all this has to work together. So it's not just scientists out doing their thing, it's doing it with the fire community and with the aim of being able to take these results and returning them back for the public. So with that, thank you for being a scientist with me this evening. And Megan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim. When I first was introduced to the concept of the FASME project, it really impressed me that this entire group that you see here on the screen is looking to move from incremental approaches to finding solutions to predicting where the smoke is going to go, to knowing how to place resources when a fire is taking place. And even like you had talked about planned burns, understand how they work and do them better. And I was just really impressed that the ambition and the dedication of this team to take a transformative approach to providing those tools. So thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. So as Tim described, FASME integrates many, many disciplines. And we're now going to dive into one of those disciplines of the FASME project, which has a very rock and roll name, Pyro Aerobiology, or a study of the life in the smoke. I'd like to introduce Dr. David Viuno. He's a research professor in civil and environmental engineering at the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado. He studies molecular microbial ecology and applies the metabolic diversity of microorganisms in engineered systems for environmental benefits. And one of the ways that he is applying the work that he does is in this study of the life in the smoke. So I'm very excited to hear what he has to say. Should be really interesting, very novel, very cutting edge work that he and his team are working on. So with that, Dave, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Megan. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Let us begin. So before I begin, what I really need to say is that, like Tim was saying, this is really a project that is very collaborative, interdisciplinary. And so I'm presenting a lot of research that we've been doing, but it's really a collection of some very, of some of my very closest colleagues that I work with. So Lita Kobziar from University of Idaho, Brent Krishner from University of Florida, Rachel Moore from Georgia Tech, Adam Watts, who's now at the U.S. Forest Service, and Adam Kachansky at University of Utah. And so the title of my talk is How Wildland Fires Aerosolize Diverse and Viable Microbial Communities into the Atmosphere and Why You Should Care. So before I begin, I'll give a quick outline. I wanted to just give a quick background on my research because I think it helps tie things together, some of my research projects and interests, and one of my other passions, which is telling stories through film, specifically science stories. And then in the life and smoke aspect of the presentation, I want to first make the case for why we should be studying wildland fires. And I think Tim did a really great job of telling us why. But from the aspect of microbes, I think why it might be important. And some of the tools that we've had to develop in order to actually study microbes in smoke. And then we're going to take a little interlude about the tree of life, because that's going to be important for us to understand the information and the data that we're looking at. And then I'll present some of the highlights from our research at the FASME burn, and what our current state of knowledge is and kind of where we're headed. Okay, so I first started studying microbiology in wastewater treatment. It's not the most glamorous place to study microbiology, but it's actually really cool. You look at that stuff under a microscope and there's all kinds of weird stuff in there. And I just wanted to learn more about it. So that's how I really got into it, because these microbes are super important for cleaning our wastewater. And one of my other passions is rock climbing. And if any of you are rock climbers out there and you had to make sure, or saw signs at the climbing gym saying, take your shoes off at the when you go into the bathroom, you could thank me and my colleagues for that, because we published a paper that suggests that there's a fecal veneer on indoor climbing wall holds. So make sure you wash your hands if you're a climber at the climbing gym. And that little research paper got us a little story in Climbing Magazine. We got a subreddit, and then I don't know for sure, but I suspect that the Big Bang Theory, you can see here the gloves that he's wearing, saw our paper and incorporated it into one of their episodes. So that was kind of fun. I've worked on projects involving disease suppressive soils and developing fungicides that prevent food crops from being consumed by pathogens. I've studied the nuances of microbial energy metabolism, so getting really deep into biochemistry and other things. And then I'm also working on kind of in line with the water treatment, but resource recovery and water treatment for sustainable gold mining in Peru. And that's where I'm currently located at the Colorado School of Mines. So in collaboration with a university in Peru. And then of course, why we're all here today, life and smoke. So my other passion is telling stories through film. And so this really started for me because I felt that it's really hard for people to change their mind from a bar graph or a pie chart or something. But when you have a really compelling story, that's when people make changes in their lives. And so it's something I like to integrate into my work. And so I've done a documentary about water and water infrastructure and water reuse, educational series on the early Earth, the microbes that live there. There's a video that you can find on the DRI YouTube channel called the Fire and Smoke Model Evaluation Experiment, which is relevant to the topic for today, and also some fun stuff that I like to do when I'm traveling. Okay, so to get into the topic, I want to begin by showing you this graphic from NASA. This is simulated aerosols across the globe. And the purpose of this is to really emphasize and exemplify to everyone why just how interconnected the Earth is. And so we know that our oceans are connected. Because we're a globalized society, we've connected each other. But the atmosphere is a very important place where things in the environment, sand, dust, microbes, moisture gets transported. And so when we think about wildland fires, they're pumping particulate matter and various other things into the atmosphere, and those things get transported far away. So it's important for us to start asking questions about what might be living in that smoke. And so that has really important implications, because we know that smoke can transport precious nutrients. We know that smoke is an important ice nucleator, so to form ice crystals and precipitation, rain and snow, for example. And we also know that that there are a lot of bacteria and fungi that get transported across continents, in the atmosphere. And so why it's important to start studying this now is this graphic here is a time-lapse video that I made that shows the continental United States and the spatial location of droughts dating back to the year 2000. So this is a time lapse of 20 years compressed into about 40 seconds maybe. And here is sort of the linear representation of that graph. And what I want to point out here is that we go through cycles of extreme drought, and then a period where you don't have a drought. And then you go through a big drought, and then you don't have a drought. And then you go through these and then another cycle. It repeats. And the issue is that the length and the duration of these droughts becomes more severe, and that's exacerbated by climate change. And of course, with more drought and hotter climate, we're going to have stronger wildfires. And so that's really the new normal. Now, what FASME allows us to do is that it gives us an opportunity to study the smoke in a systematic and in a safe way. So that's something that's really important to point out. And there's some opportunities for studying the effects on human health, the transport, at least in my field, the transport of microorganisms, and what their effects might be on ecosystem function, because microbes are very important in recycling nutrients, and also on the discovery of new microbes and potentially new compounds that microbes produce that would be beneficial for us. So, very simple question: is there anything alive in smoke? And surprisingly, there were not many people asking this question. There was really just one fire ecologist asking this question, and she's my collaborator, Lita Kobziar. There she is right there. So she approached me several years ago with my other colleague, Adam Watts, started wondering, how can we study microbes in smoke? How can we look at their DNA and figure out who's there? And so Lita, I'm going to present a little bit of Lita's early research, because this is sort of the most important part. This is what sort of brought us down this path. But one of the crucial discoveries was, and this is a culture-based study, but what Dr. Kobziar discovered was that if you position samplers adjacent to a flame front, and at various distance away from the flame front, what you find is that the closer you are, the more microbial colonies you get growing on petri dishes. This is a very simple study. It is something you can maybe do it safely, but we do. These are very prepared types of experiments. And so what was the main discovery here is that this is sort of the visual representation. So as you're closer to the flame front, the more microbes you get, and the farther away, the fewer microbial colonies you get. So that sort of jotted our memory. I jotted our intrigue into wondering, well, what other microbes are actually living there? Now, we wanted to get off the ground and we wanted to get into the air. And so, of course, that was initially a bit of an engineering challenge, but there's been a lot of development in the use of unmanned aerial systems or drones. And so what's really unique about these types of platforms is that, one, they're relatively low cost. They're very easy to maneuver. You can position it exactly where you want it at various heights. You can take replicate samples. And primarily it poses by using a UAS or a drone, it's much less risky to the person sampling. So you're not close to the fire itself. And so Dr. Watts and Dr. Kobziar, they really, and their team, they really developed some unique sampling systems to then put onto these drones so that we can go and do our science. And so some of those things were, for example, capturing real-time particulate matter measurements, temperature, concentration of carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and then also kind of my specialty is studying microbiology, or studying the microbes, microbial communities through DNA analysis. And so in the FASME burn that Tim showed you, we went back to the Fish Lake National Forest, and we went with the intention of sampling microbes from these massive smoke plumes that were generated from the Forest Service. And so we had really two main questions: do microbes survive these high intensity forest fires, and also which ones are there? And And then could they play a role in cloud formation? And so I'm going to talk more about item number 1 here. Okay, here's our quick interlude, because before I get into any more in-depth information, I need to tell you about the tree of life, because for one, it's probably one of the most important organizational principles in biology. And it's important to know that there are 3 domains of life. So we have on the top, the bacteria, and that comprises a very large group of a diverse group of organisms. And this branch coming down from the bottom splits right about here into what are called the Archaea, and the other branch are the eukaryotes. So bacteria are microscopic. Their average size is about 1 micron. And to give you a quick comparison here to kind of get your bearings, a human hair is about 100 microns, and the average size of the COVID virus is about 0.1 micron. And so Archaea are also microscopic. They're also on average about 1 micron in size. But of course, the third branch of life, eukaryotes, they are, that comprises fungi, plants, animals, insects. Anything you can see is a eukaryote. And so this is important because when we think about microbes in the atmosphere, sure, there's a concern that they could be pathogenic, they could harm us. But something important to understand is that throughout our whole evolutionary history, we've evolved with microbes. So they're very beneficial to us, and they provide a lot of protection in a sense. They protect us by the beneficial bacteria being on us and in our ecosystem. They sort of prevent harmful microbes from colonizing and getting you sick, messing things up. And what's really important about microbes is that they're sort of like biogeochemical engines. They transform nutrients, they recycle them, they reuse them, they keep the earth healthy. So very important. Microorganisms are very important. So going back to FASME, so when we went there to set up our sampling equipment and the fires were ignited, we had our drones set up out in a field, and the smoke plume you can see right here in front of us. So we knew where we were going. We knew where we were sampling. Very controlled setting. Of course, when the wind blows the wrong direction, you get something like this, which caused us to evacuate. But everyone was safe. But this is what's so cool about this type of research. So some of the samples that we had, we looked at cells under the microscope, and we compared ambient air to smoke. And so in these pictures, what you have is, so this is a scale bar for 10 microns. And so this is a cell in green. That's a fluorescently labeled microbial cell under the microscope. You can see it's about 1 micron in size. And in the smoke, what you see is that you have a lot of microbes attached to particulate matter. So, so right then and there, you get a very good sense that there are a lot of microbes in smoke. And if we can kind of go back and extrapolate how many microbes are actually in this smoke plume, it turns out that there's quite a lot. And what I've done here is calculated out the number of cells just in this one burn unit alone to be about 5.7 with 16 zeros after it. So it's a pretty big number. If we calculate the weight of those microbes, I was trying to figure out, it's about 7.4 kilograms of microbes per hectare. So it's approximately 7% of the total particulate matter in the smoke plume itself. That would be microbial mass. But I was trying to find a way to kind of compare it, and I found what might be one of my most favorite websites, which was called Weight and Things. So I typed in 7.3 kilogram, and it said you weigh like 2,368 tea bags. Or if you were a white and blue casino chip, you would weigh $18,500. Or my favorite was, you weigh about 94,000 excited bees. So to give you a sense of what we're dealing with just in 1 hectare alone, there's a lot of cells going into the atmosphere. And so when we went in and actually tried to quantify how many microbes were there, it's very drastic. On average, there's about 26,000 cells per cubic meter in ambient air, but in smoke, it jumps up to about 100,000. And to give you a frame of reference, there's a manuscript that says that in a hurricane, an entire hurricane, there was approximately 1.5 times 10 to the 5, so about the same amount of microbes found in an entire hurricane just in the smoke that samples compared to the smoke samples that we analyze ourselves. Now, another question was, are they alive? And it turns out there are more microbes alive in the smoke and in the ambient air than there are dead. So that right then and there, it was a very shocking result for us. You would think that a fire would sterilize everything, it would kill everything. But in fact, there's a lot of uncombusted material. There's a lot of, the smoke itself, the smoke particles will, have microbes attached to it, like in that microscope image I showed previously. And the majority of the microbes, about 75% of the microbes in the smoke were alive. So very, very fascinating result. Now, this looks like a complicated figure, but I'm going to try to break it down for you relatively quick. What we have here are the bacteria and archaea. Those are the 2 microscopic branches of life that I mentioned earlier. And over here on the right side, we have the eukaryotes. And here are the eukaryotes sort of as a whole. And then I've subsetted it out so that we've just looked at fungi. And so the colors represent all the different types. It's called a phylum level classification, which is sort of like a very high level classification. It gives you a sense of the community composition. And when you look deeply into that community composition, what you find is that in the smoke itself, the smoke samples are what you might say are enriched or elevated in concentration with microbes that are associated with soil. So that was an interesting finding. So somehow soil microbes from the soil and from the surrounding environment, and also microbes that are associated with living on plants as well, get entrained in the smoke plume and are in the smoke, and are now being transported off into the environment. Over here is a figure which basically in green we have the ambient air, and then in the orangey color is the smoke. And basically what these circles represent is that the further these clusters are apart, the less similar they are, and the closer they are together, the more similar. And so this figure here, well, I'll just mention this, is that it really focuses on the bacteria, and these are very distinct communities. So the smoke is very different from the air. That's the take-home message. With regard to the eukaryotes, what we found was that the majority of the taxa that we found were consisted of fungi, about 60%, and there was also a lot of plant DNA. So kind of falls in line with what you might expect. And then one of our final results here that I want to point out is that there were significantly more taxa in the smoke, both in regards to, this is kind of a Venn diagram. So so here, what you have is the number of taxa in the smoke versus in ambient, and the number that overlap between them across the different groups that we analyze. So this is the bacteria, and then this is the eukaryotes over here, and the fungi over here. And then what we also found was that a significant difference in the diversity of microbes. So much more diverse in smoke than in ambient air. So what this really means is that, well, for one, we have to acknowledge that to try to attempt to do research like this in a real wildfire would be extremely dangerous, just for how close you'd have to get. So what's great about these prescribed burns is that it enables us to study smoke safely, but also systematically. We know what's being burned. We know the fuels. We can measure all the external factors, beforehand. So that gives us a tremendous scientific power to study things. But I want to make this point that we think of a wildfire injecting all the smoke into the atmosphere, and it's almost like a biological volcano, maybe as an analogy. And so these microbes aren't being killed, but what it's effectively doing is that it's allowing them to migrate from one place to another. So this is something that is very new to our understanding. We know that microbes travel on dust. We know that microbes travel, on smoke. We know they travel in clouds, but we just didn't know too much about smoke as being a potential habitat. And smoke, of course, has carbon, it has nutrients, so it is a potential habitat for microbes. So these are some of the things that we'd like to study more. And lastly, I mentioned ice nucleation, and that's something that we're looking into even more. Is that what are the effects on climate? With more smoke going into the atmosphere. And so this field is really a new field that was developed by my colleague Lida. It's the intersection of fire ecology, microbiology, and smoke science, which she termed Pyro Aerobiology. So a new field of science. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. It's really striking, and I want to point this out for our listeners out there, that pyrobiology and the work that you all are doing has such a cool intersection between the big questions in science, advances in technology and using UAS and other tools to do this work in the field, in situ, in the plan burn, and the application of it. I'm sure you could give a whole talk on implications for human health and things like that. And I just think it is such a cool intersection from, the pure science, the big scientific questions spans that whole spectrum to the applied science. So thank you so much for sharing that cool work with us. We are really lucky because this work we're really on the cutting edge. So thank you so much. And we've now gotten to my favorite part of the evening. And I'm going to introduce Allie, who's going to facilitate the Q&A. So like she said in the chat, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. And with that, I'm turning it over to Allie.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you to our wonderful speakers. Our first question tonight, so here's how we're going to do this. So you've been sending your questions in to me, and we've been picking a few out that will appeal to the speakers and then I think they can both speak to. And so I'm going to just read your name, and if you would like to read your question, that would be great. And if you'd prefer not to, just let me know and I'd be happy to read it out for you. Our first question is going to go for Tim Brown, and it's going to come from Abhinav Gupta. Abhinav, if you'd like to unmute yourself and come on camera, you're welcome to do so and ask Tim your question.
Hi, Tim. So my question is, how long does it take for the forest to recover from the fire? So basically, what I mean by recovery is how long. By recovery, I mean the functions of the forest. For example, how long would it take for the forest to generate the same evapotranspiration as it was doing before the fire?
Right. Well, that's a great question, and in fact, there's a whole field of study about this in fire ecology. The cynical answer would be 50 to 70 tons, because that's the point that means that we haven't taken care of the forest after the last fire, and so it's come back and it's starting all over again. But really, the proper answer is it is going to depend on forest type. Some forests could take 60 to 100 years to return to what their natural state might be. There is something called stand replacement fire that occurs naturally, has occurred naturally in history. And it was a process in which the forest actually did burn pretty severely in an effort to regenerate itself. So if you have a high severity fire, that's going to do more damage to the forest. It may bake out microbes in the soils, change the chemistry of the soil. If it's a low severity fire, that's not going to happen as much. But the biggest question here, also related to this, is what's going to be the impact of climate change? What will warmer climates, drier climates, what will this do to the type of vegetation that comes back and repopulates after a burn?
Yep, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Okay, our next question is going to be for David. I'm going to have Kim Glock ask this question about microbes. Kim, if you'd like to come on camera and unmute yourself, you're welcome to ask David your question.
Oh, I can read it too.
Okay, good. She is not able to. So David, if you could mind getting that one out.
No problem. So the question is, are these microbes specific to a local area, or are they microbes that are so-called universal? Is this perhaps a way for them to survive and reproduce? Okay, so what we found is that it appears that the microbes that we found, it appears that they're consistent with being from sort of a regional, local or regional area. The microbes that we found, I'm not sure I would say they're universal, but they are microbes that are, a lot of the microbes that we found are common in the air. But what's unique about what we found is the proportion of the different microbes. The community structure itself is shifted from what we normally find in the air. So they're they're common. Some of them are very common. Some of them are not so common. But it's the composition that's different. So that's what I would say about that. Now, is this perhaps a way for them to survive and reproduce? Absolutely. A microbe, bacteria or any life, it needs 4 things to survive. It needs water, it needs a carbon source, it needs an energy source, and it needs something to breathe. And so in a smoke particle, you have a carbon source, a slightly toasted carbon source, but it's a carbon source nonetheless. The atmosphere has water vapor, so there's water, and there's certainly going to be things to breathe and energy sources there as well. So it's possible, and those are some of the things that we're looking at right now.
Awesome. There's also a question here from Lori Kemper. Lori, you asked a question about the microbes that are alive and the role that they play in the restoration. Do you want to come on and give us your wording exactly? You're welcome to come join the conversation, Lori.
Hi, David. I'm actually a retired environmental engineer, and so this is really fascinating. I did a lot of wastewater, played in a lot of that, but I also worked here in the Tahoe Basin on watershed restoration and following the Angora fire. But and now I'm just, a recent returnee from my 2 weeks of evacuation. But I just wanted to know, if any of those microbes are harmful to human health. I mean, you explained they're mostly from their typical soil bacteria, so probably not. But the other question is, do these microbes that are alive play a role in the restoration of plant life that occurs after a fire?
Okay, so let me address the first part, which was potential pathogens. There certainly could be. However, I would say they're at a concentration that is low enough that it's probably, with a healthy immune system, you'd have no problem fighting it off. I mean, our bodies are very resilient to that kind of stuff. Of course, breathing in smoke itself is not, not great for our lungs either. So I'd probably say there's probably more of a risk of that than of a pathogen. But we don't know yet. Those are still things that we're trying to find out. And it may not necessarily be just human pathogens, but also plant pathogens. Fungal spores, for example, might be able to get transported. That might be able to invade or a new environment that's not accustomed to that particular pathogen or parasite. Now, as far as reclamation, I think the question is, can they be used for reclamation of burned areas? Is that
Well, yeah, do they have a role? I mean, I guess it sounds like one of the research questions for the future, the question you just brought up about fungal or parasitic type of, or pathogens, that's a good question, because as Dr. Brown talked about, you're working in these forests that are decadent and maybe already have a lot of disease, and you certainly wouldn't want to think that because you're introducing fire, like you're spreading that disease, right? So that sounds like a really good question to look into in the future. And then my other question really was just the notion that you mentioned that the microbes are alive, they're mostly close to the source, where the fire is occurring. But if they land on the ground, then do they have a role in helping with plant restoration when plants come back on their own? I mean, I'm not talking about humans' involvement, but more, is that part of what nature does? Is these microbes now help stimulate and support plant growth after a fire?
Yes, absolutely. So, I get it. Now, it's always the scientific answer is it depends. But in general, the transport of new microbes to new environments boosts biodiversity. And we know that biodiversity is very important for keeping lots of functions redundant, keeping functions resilient, keeping ecosystems resilient. And so when an environment is, depending on the burn severity, if the soil is totally charred, it leaves a new environment for microbes to colonize. So if the smoke microbes land in an environment that has been burned and it's disturbed, then I would say, this is just a little bit of speculation, but my best guess would be that yes, it would definitely play a role in plant restoration. Of course, you need other ingredients. You need water. That would be very important. And time, it takes time for the microbes to start colonizing and growing and things. So yeah, I would say mostly, for the most part, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Our next question is coming to us from YouTube, actually. This is from Pat. So this question is for Tim Brown, but I'm hoping that David will take the second half of it as well. So if you'll both answer this one. So Pat wants to know, how do you control a controlled burn? And what impact on wildland fire science do you hope to have made by the end of your career? So if you'll both talk about impact, and Tim, if you want to talk about controlling.
Sure, or controlling impacts. Is that an option?
Sure.
So to do a controlled burn, it actually requires a lot of planning. There are a lot of checklists, and that planning can start actually years before a burn actually takes place. But the first key question is, what is the burn for? Is it because you need to reduce hazardous fuel? Is it because you need to remove an invasive species that just doesn't belong there? Is it because you're trying to restore a wildlife habitat? So there's all kinds of reasons for doing the burn. And once you know that, then you can start to piece together, well, what are the parameters of the burn? What are the types of fuel that you're trying to remove or work with? And under what conditions will that burn best to meet that goal? So those are called prescription parameters, and it's things like temperature and wind speed and moisture, those sorts of things. And then when it's time to do the burn, there's a checklist before it's a go, no-go decision. And one of those might be, will there be any smoke issues? You don't want to send the smoke right to a community, to a sensitive receptor or a community that could impact. You're going to get weather forecasts from the National Weather Service. You're going to set up, you're going to make sure what are your boundaries around the fire to be able to contain it. So those are just examples. I mean, the list is bigger, but I think those are some of the key things. Well, impact. I think the thing that really comes to mind is not like a single project kind of impact. I'm very keen to see something like FASME actually happen the way that we want it, because that's such a grand scale, and the amount of data that could be collected are going to be used for so many different aspects of fire and so many different disciplines. But what I really like to do is hear from the practitioner, the fire manager. What is it that you need that I can help with? And if I can provide that, whether it's data, a product, an idea, information, whatever it is that helps them with their decision, and ultimately that benefit to society, that's my intersection. That's where I want to be.
Love that. What about you, David? What impact do you want to make by the end of your career?
You know, for me, I love history, and microbes are a part of Earth history. And one of the things that I see is not only better understanding what microbes are out there and how they are integral to our everyday life, and how we might be breathing them in, and how that might affect our health positively or negatively. But being able to discover new microbes so that it teaches us something more about who we are as a species and our place on Earth. So that's kind of to go a little philosophical.
Thank you both. Megan, I know we're running over. We just had a ton of questions, so thank you.
I'm so glad we got to hear all those questions and those fabulous responses. I want to thank both of our speakers sincerely. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. It's inspiring. Our communities are in good hands, knowing that you're looking after wild and fire science in the way that you are. Before we close, I would love to invite Kelly back to share anything that's going on at Patagonia coming up that we can keep an eye out for.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to our speakers. Another amazing part of the Science Distilled this evening. And we are planning on Science Distilled for October 20th. And our hope we'll keep you posted on whether or not we can have it in store or in this forum as well. And then another just really important event that's near and dear to our hearts is we have one of our employees, Bob Hammer, who is a member of our community and also the Down syndrome community in Reno. He went through the journey of summiting the Grand Tetons a couple of years ago, and it was filmed. And this film is going to be premiering on Thursday, October 7th. It's in the evening at the Riverside Farmers Market. It's going to be outdoors. So hopefully that will create a very safe space for everyone to gather as a community and celebrate what he did. And he'll be there to speak as well. So please mark your calendars. It's going to be a family-friendly event. Bring a picnic blanket and your family. It's going to start at 5:30. So we'd love to have you there and to help us celebrate what Bob has accomplished. So thank you again, and hope to see everyone at next month's Science Distilled.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. If you want to share this with your family and friends, you can find the recording of this event and our previous events on YouTube. Just search DRI Science or The Discovery. So thanks again. We're going to close. Take care, and we will see you for our next event. Stay safe.